My name is Grax Valoon, third-tier intelligence analyst for the Sorvathi Collective, and I want it noted in the official record that none of this was my fault. I filed the reports, I submitted the warnings, I flagged the humans 4 separate times, and 4 separate times High Commander Drevoxal waved his upper appendage at me and said, "Grax, they are barely a spacefaring species, they still argue about the shape of their own planet." And then he laughed, he actually laughed. I want that noted too. Now let me take you back to before the catastrophe, before the smoke cleared, before 27 senior military officers across 3 galactic civilizations collectively submitted resignation letters on the same afternoon. Let me take you back to the war itself. The Vithori-Sorvathi War. 112 years old. The longest active armed conflict in the Galactic Cooperative's recorded history, which, for context, spans roughly 9,000 years. We were the record holders, we had plaques. There was a museum on Korath 4th dedicated entirely to our inability to stop fighting each other, and it had excellent gift shop ratings. The cause of the war, you ask? Well, if you asked a Sorvathi, we would tell you the Vithori stole the Tauran Belt asteroid cluster in the year 2244 by the old calendar. If you asked a Vithori, they would tell you we provoked them by planting an unauthorized mining station on what they considered sacred gravitational territory. And if you asked anyone else in the galaxy, they would sigh very heavily and change the subject, because after a century of this, everyone was deeply, profoundly tired. The Galactic Cooperative had attempted peace negotiations 47 times, 47. I have the files. Each negotiation collapsed within an average of 6.3 solar cycles, usually due to what the diplomats politely called a fundamental breakdown in communicative good faith, which is a very elegant way of saying both sides were absolute nightmares to deal with. The war had settled into a kind of grinding, miserable rhythm by the time I joined the intelligence division. Neither side could win outright. Neither side could afford to lose. We had essentially agreed, without ever saying so aloud, to be permanently, expensively miserable in the name of pride. And then the humans applied for cooperative membership. I remember the day the application arrived at Central Command. Admiral Prathis Van, who commanded our Eastern Fleet, read the transmission summary and then set it down very slowly on his desk, in the manner of someone who has just received unexpected news and is not sure yet whether it is the good kind or the terrible kind. "Humanity," he said. "Yes, Admiral," said his adjutant, a young officer named Soli Drak, who had, at that point, not yet learned to control her facial expressions in the presence of superiors, the ones who have been at war with themselves for the entirety of their recorded history. "Largely, yes, Admiral. The species that invented a weapon capable of ending all life on their planet and then, having invented it, tested it, repeatedly. 45 times, sir, by our count, though some of those were underground." Admiral Prathis Van was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "File it with the cooperative. Standard membership review. They will not be admitted for at least a decade, given the processing time alone." And he was right about the processing time. Sort of. What he did not account for was the humans' complete inability to wait patiently for anything. The Cooperative Review Board scheduled humanity's first formal assessment for 8 standard months after the application. The humans showed up 3 months early, unannounced, in a ship that looked like it had been assembled by enthusiastic children who had seen a real spacecraft once in a photograph. Their lead representative, a small woman named Counselor Mira Voss, walked into the cooperative reception chamber and immediately started asking questions about the Vithori-Sorvathi War, because apparently on the journey over, her team had read the entire public archive of cooperative conflicts and decided to have opinions about all of them. I know this because I was assigned as their Sorvathi liaison. That was my punishment for filing too many inconvenient reports. I was given the humans. Counselor Mira Voss had dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything, and she had the unsettling habit of asking questions while already knowing most of the answer, which meant she was less asking and more testing, which I found exhausting and a little rude. "So," she said approximately 11 minutes after arriving, sitting across from me in a briefing room that smelled like recycled atmosphere and bureaucratic regret, "This war, the Tauran Belt thing, has anyone actually done a legal survey of the original boundary lines?" "Multiple surveys," I said. "And what did they show?" "Conflicting results. Because the surveys were done by each side independently?" I paused. "Yes." Mira Voss nodded slowly, in the way of someone filing information into a mental cabinet labeled "as I suspected." Then she said, "Interesting. and wrote something down, and I had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that I had just told her something she was going to use later in a way I would not enjoy. I reported this conversation to High Commander Drivok Sal. I told him the human representative seemed unusually focused on the war's origins. He told me I was reading too much into things. He used the word paranoid. He offered me what he thought was a reassuring gesture with his secondary limbs. 3 weeks later, Mira Voss filed a formal third-party conflict analysis with the Cooperative Council. It was 48 pages long. I read all 48 pages. I read them in one sitting, which for a Sorvathi takes approximately the time a human would spend watching 2 of their shorter entertainments. And when I finished, I sat very still in my chair, because the document was, without question, the most methodically devastating piece of conflict analysis I had encountered in 22 years of intelligence work. She had not taken sides. That was the first thing. It would have been easy to dismiss if she had taken sides. Instead, she had done something far more dangerous. She had taken both sides simultaneously, explained exactly how each party's logic was internally consistent given their own historical records, and then pointed out, with the serene confidence of someone who has nothing to lose, that both sets of historical records had been selectively maintained to support predetermined conclusions, and that a neutral survey of the original Toran Belt stellar cartography, using archived cooperative data that predated the war by 60 years, suggested the actual boundary in dispute covered approximately 12% of the total territory both sides were currently fighting over. 12%! We had been at war for 112 years over 12% of the original territory. I want to be absolutely clear. I knew this. I had known something like this for years. Most of the senior analysts knew something like this. But we existed in a system where knowing an uncomfortable truth and being allowed to say it loudly in front of the Cooperative Council were 2 entirely different things. Mira Voss was not part of that system. Yet, High Commander Drevok Sal called me to his office when the report circulated. He had the expression of someone who has just bitten into food that turned out to be a completely different food than expected. Not poisoned, necessarily, just very, very surprising. "This human," he said. "Councillor Voss, sir. She filed this with the full council. With 3 appendices, sir. The 3rd appendix is a proposed boundary settlement framework." His expression moved through several distinct phases. "She has been here for less than a month. 26 days, sir. We have been fighting this war for over a century, Grax. 112 years, sir. And she..." 26 days, yes. The commander was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, in a tone that had gone remarkably flat, "Get me everything we have on human military history." And that was when I knew. That was the precise moment when I understood that the comfortable, predictable, endlessly grinding war we had all built our careers around was about to become something else entirely. Because I had already read the human military history files, all of them, cover to cover, twice in the weeks since Mira Voss arrived and started asking her very pointed questions. And if the commander was only now asking for those files, then we were already behind. The Vithori, it turned out, had received the same report. Their response was to immediately request a private session with Councillor Voss, which she agreed to, and which she attended alone, which her own delegation apparently told her was an extremely bad idea, and which she did anyway. She came back from that meeting 3 hours later, sat down across from me in the briefing room again and said, "They're scared." "The Vithori?" I said. "Of losing," she said. "Not of us, not yet. Of ending the war and having nothing to show for it. That's the actual problem. You both need a reason to stop that doesn't look like surrender." I looked at her for a moment. "You figured this out in 3 hours." "I figured this out on the ship coming over," she said pleasantly. "The 3 hours were just confirmation." I filed another report to High Commander Drevok Sal that evening. This time I did not bury the conclusion in careful language. I wrote plainly in the summary field at the top of the document, "The human representative has identified the war's psychological core and is actively working toward a resolution framework. Recommend we take her seriously before she solves this without us." For the first time in 4 reports, the commander did not dismiss it. He called a senior staff meeting for the following morning. And as I walked to that meeting, through the long corridors of Central Command, past the maps and the tactical displays and the portraits of admirals who had spent their entire careers on a war that might be ending in the hands of a single small human woman with a notebook and a very inconvenient habit of being right, I thought about what Mira Voss had said in our very first meeting. Has anyone actually done a legal survey? Such a simple question, such an obvious question. The kind of question that could only be asked by someone who had not yet learned which questions were not supposed to be asked. And I thought, we are either in very good hands or we are in a great deal of trouble. I suspected, with the weary instinct of a man who has filed too many ignored reports, that the answer was probably both. The senior staff meeting lasted 4 hours. I know because I counted every single minute of it with the quiet desperation of someone watching a slow disaster unfold from a very uncomfortable chair. High Commander Drevok Sal had assembled every senior officer in the Sorvathi chain of command. Fleet Admiral Preethus Van attended via long-range link from the Eastern Theater. Vice Admiral Chorus Mott, who commanded our logistics division and who I had always suspected was slightly more intelligent than he let on, sat at the far end of the table saying nothing and watching everything. There were 16 of them in total, plus me, the analyst, who had been invited because apparently 4 ignored reports had finally earned me a seat at the table, though nobody offered me refreshments. The commander opened by presenting Counselor Voss's 48-page analysis to the group as if they had not all already read it 3 times. Then Fleet Admiral Preethus Van said, over the long-range link in a voice that suggested he had not slept recently, "I want to discuss the third appendix. The third appendix. The Boundary Settlement Framework. The thing Mira Voss had constructed in 26 days that our own diplomatic corps had failed to produce in 112 years. It was elegant, which was the part that bothered everyone most. Not provocative. Not radical. Just quietly, infuriatingly logical. She had taken the archived cooperative cartography data, applied a standard neutral arbitration model that the cooperative itself had developed for exactly this kind of territorial dispute, and produced a boundary line that gave each side slightly less than they wanted and slightly more than they currently had any legal basis to claim. She had then attached projected economic modeling showing that ending the war would generate more resource revenue for both civilizations within 15 years than either side had extracted from the contested territory in the entire duration of the conflict. She had also included, in a footnote so small it almost looked like an accident, the total casualty figures for both sides across 112 years. That footnote was why nobody in the room would look directly at the document. "The Vithori have seen this," said Vice Admiral Chorus Mott, speaking for the first time. He had a slow, deliberate way of talking that made everything sound like it had already been decided. "Their council met last night. Our intelligence has the preliminary read. They are not dismissing it." "Of course they are not dismissing it," said Fleet Admiral Van. "The framework gives them the outer transit corridor and joint administrative rights over the Torin processing stations. They would be foolish to dismiss it. It also gives us the primary mineral extraction rights and removes the Vithori claim from the northern asteroid cluster entirely," said Chorus Matt. "Which they never had a strong legal basis for anyway," I said. Everyone looked at me. I had apparently not yet re-earned the right to speak at these meetings without causing a mild disruption. I pressed on anyway because I had been pressing on for 22 years and it seemed too late to develop self-preservation instincts now. The framework works because it is based on what both sides can actually justify, not on what both sides have been insisting on. There is a difference. Counselor Voss found the space between those two things and built a door in it. A long silence. Then High Commander Drevok Sal said with great reluctance, "What does she want in return?" Excellent question. Deeply uncomfortable question. Because here is the thing about Mira Voss that I had slowly come to understand over our 26 days of acquaintance. She was not doing this out of pure altruism, because no one ever does anything out of pure altruism, and anyone who claims otherwise is either lying or not paying attention. She was doing this because humanity needed cooperative membership, and humanity needed cooperative membership because they were, as a species, standing on the edge of their own solar system with a shipbuilding program that was expanding at a rate that made every existing member nation quietly nervous, and Mira Voss understood that the fastest way to turn nervous neighbors into hostile ones was to show up at the gate without an invitation. What she wanted was a sponsor. 2 sponsors specifically because cooperative bylaws required 2 existing members to formally endorse a new application. And the 2 most influential voices in the cooperative, the 2 whose endorsement would make all other endorsements follow almost automatically, were the Sorvathi and the Vithori. The 2 sides currently at war with each other. "She wants us to end the war," said Fleet Admiral Van slowly, as the full geometry of it settled into the room. "And in doing so we become the co-sponsors of humanity's membership, which positions both of us as the civilizations that brought the new species in, which is a significant political asset, and which also means we are now formally allied with a species that—" He stopped. "That what, Admiral?" I asked. He looked at his display, at the human military history files the commander had requested. That has been at war continuously for the majority of its documented existence, he said carefully, and has never once lost a war on its home territory. Another silence. A different quality of silence this time. The kind that happens when a room full of intelligent people all arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously and nobody particularly wants to say it first. I said it, because someone had to, and I was already on thin ice, so what was a little more water? The Vithori have the same read, I said. They know what the history files say. They know what humanity's military capability trajectory looks like if they continue developing at the current rate without the moderating influence of cooperative membership and treaty obligations. The choice is not between war and peace with the Vithori. The choice is between managing that transition now, on our terms, with all parties cooperative and grateful, or managing it later, under circumstances nobody in this room wants to imagine. Fleet Admiral Van rubbed the area above his primary optical sensors, which for a Sorvathi is the equivalent of a human pressing their fingers to the bridge of their nose and breathing slowly. She knew we would reach this conclusion. She reached it before she boarded the ship to get here, I said. How confident are you in that assessment, Grax? I thought about the dark eyes that moved constantly, the questions that were already answers, the footnote with the casualty figures that she put there not because she needed to, but because she knew exactly which number would land in exactly which part of our chest. Completely, I said. The meeting ended 2 hours later with a provisional authorization for the commander to open formal back-channel dialogue with his Vithori counterpart, Supreme Marshal Dovin Keth, using Councillor Voss's framework as the working document. It was not yet a peace agreement. It was not even close to a peace agreement. It was two people agreeing to read the same piece of paper, which in the context of a 112-year war was genuinely an enormous step. I was sent to inform Mira Voss. She was in the small quarters she had been assigned in the diplomatic wing, sitting at a desk covered in physical papers because apparently some humans still preferred those, drinking something hot from a container that she had brought from her ship because she did not trust our synthesized beverages, which, frankly, was reasonable. I told her that the commander had authorized back-channel dialogue. She nodded. I told her the Vithori were not dismissing the framework. She nodded again. I said, you already knew this would happen. I hoped it would happen, she said. There is a difference. Not as much of one as you are implying. She looked at me with the small, careful expression she used when she was deciding how honest to be. Then she said, Grax, can I ask you something? I said yes, because at that point refusing her question seemed both futile and rude. Why did this take 112 years? I opened my mouth, closed it. The truthful answer was complicated and uncomfortable, and involved a great many structural incentives and institutional inertias and the simple, grinding reality that wars, once started, develop their own bureaucracies, their own economies, their own constituencies of people whose careers depend on the fighting continuing. The truthful answer was not flattering to anyone, including me. Because nobody was willing to say the quiet part loudly, I said finally. Mira Voss nodded. That is the most honest thing you have said to me. I have been extremely honest with you. You have been accurate, she said. That is different. I thought about that for a long time after I left her quarters. I thought about it through the back-channel negotiations that began the following week, which moved with a speed that seemed to physically distress everyone involved, because both sides had grown so accustomed to the comfortable pace of failed diplomacy that actual progress felt like falling. I thought about it when Supreme Marshal Dovin Keth on the 4th day of talks said, out loud in front of witnesses, that the Tauran Belt Boundary Survey had always been conducted in bad faith, which was the first time in 112 years that a senior Vithori official had admitted to anything, and which caused 3 Sorvathi diplomats to require a brief recess to compose themselves. And I thought about it, most of all, on the morning of the 2nd day after formal peace negotiations officially opened, when Mira Voss and Dovin Keth and Drevok Sal sat down together in the cooperative's primary mediation chamber and signed the preliminary ceasefire agreement that ended active hostilities in the Vithori-Sorvathi War. Day 1 of formal talks, the framework was presented, debated, annotated, and accepted in principle by both delegations. Day 2, the ceasefire was signed. 112 years, 2 days. I was standing at the back of the chamber when it happened. Not at the table, because I was an analyst, not a diplomat, and analysts stood at the back. But I was there. I watched Drevok Sal press his seal to the document. I watched Dovin Keth do the same. I watched Mira Voss countersign as the third-party facilitating witness in the small, precise handwriting of someone who has been signing important documents her whole life and has learned to make them legible, and then it was done. The war that had outlasted careers, generations, the entire recorded history of 24 smaller civilizations that had risen and fallen while we were too busy fighting to notice, was over. Ended not by military victory, not by economic collapse, not by the exhaustion of resources, ended by a woman with a notebook and 48 pages and the specific, devastating audacity to ask a question everyone else had decided was not allowed. In the corridor afterward, I found myself walking beside Counselor Voss toward the reception the cooperative was hosting in the main hall. There were lights, there was noise, there was the particular quality of celebration that happens when relief is bigger than joy. She was quiet, which was unusual for her. "You are not celebrating," I said. "I am," she said, internally. "That is a very small celebration for ending a century-long war." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The hard part is not ending the war, Grax. The hard part is what comes after. Making sure the boundary holds. Making sure the economic cooperation actually develops. Making sure both sides find something else to build their identity around, because you have both been defined by this conflict for longer than anyone currently alive can remember." She paused. "That is the work. What happened today was just the beginning of it." I looked at her sideways. "Is that why you wanted cooperative membership? So you could stay involved in the after?" "Partly," she said. And then she smiled, which she did rarely, and which, when it happened, had the slightly unnerving quality of a door opening onto something much larger than the room suggested. "Also, we genuinely need the trade routes. Our asteroid mining program is going to require distribution infrastructure we cannot build alone." I laughed. I did not intend to laugh. But she said it so plainly, the grand diplomatic ambition and the practical logistics sitting side by side with perfect comfort, that it came out before I could stop it. "You are a very strange species," I said. "We have heard that," she said. The cooperative formally accepted humanity's membership application 11 days later, co-sponsored by the Sorvathi Collective and the Vithori Alliance, which was a sentence that would have seemed impossible to write a month prior and which the cooperative archivist reportedly had to read 3 times before processing it. I was reassigned 2 weeks after that. Back to standard intelligence analysis, no longer a diplomatic liaison, because Mira Voss had taken on a permanent cooperative advisory role and no longer needed a babysitter, which was a word she used once and which I looked up later and decided I found more amusing than offensive. On my last day as her liaison, she handed me a copy of the original 48-page report, printed on physical paper, signed at the bottom. I still have it. It sits on the shelf above my workstation between 2 analysis manuals and a commendation I received years ago for a report that nobody read. I have read her document many more times since then. Not because I need to, but because I find it useful to remember what it looks like when someone refuses to treat a question as unanswerable just because it has not been answered yet. The Vithori-Sorvathi War ended on the 44th day of humanity's contact with the Galactic Cooperative. The formal peace treaty was ratified 11 days later. The museum on Korath IV, the one dedicated to our inability to stop fighting, quietly updated its signage. The gift shop, I am told, added a new section. It sells very well. And somewhere in the records of the Cooperative Intelligence Division there are 4 consecutive reports filed by one Grax Valoon analyst, 3rd tier, all flagging the potential significance of the human representative in terms that were dismissed in sequence as overcautious, excessive, paranoid, and unnecessary. The 5th report, filed the day after the ceasefire signing, contained only one line. "I told you so." High Commander Drevok Saul never responded to that one either. But I heard from Soli Drak, his adjutant, that he kept it.